Good evening and welcome. We just wait for people to arrive before we begin. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar, the conversation between Mark O'Connell and journalist Sophie Gorman in advance of the first theatre performance of To Be a Machine version 1.0 at the CENTQUATRE in Paris, as part of the International Festival of Digital Arts NEMO, Biennale Internationale des Arts Numériques de la Région Ile-de-France. A journalist and essayist, Mark talks tonight about his book, To Be a Machine, translated into French as Aventures, chez les transhumanistes by Édition L'Échappée. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks, Nora, and a very big welcome to you, Mark. It would be great if we could meet in person, but it's somehow almost fitting that we're doing this online. And we all seem to exist framed by Zoom at the moment, so the transhumanists must be delighted by this, this progression to the online world. So as Nora mentioned, we want to start talking about the book, To Be a Machine, and in it you explore the extremely complex world of transhumanism as men, and I believe it is predominantly men, strive to outwit and outlast morality. Can you explain, first of all, just for anybody, what exactly transhumanism is, and this perhaps people haven't heard this about this attempt to overcome the minor obstacle of mortality?
Yeah, well, what you've just said is as good a description of it as I could probably offer myself. But it is, to just expand on that a little bit, it is, as you say, an attempt to overcome death through technological means. So it's really a kind of a social movement organized around this idea that through taking technology into our bodies, we can sort of transcend the limits of the human condition. We can become smarter than we are, stronger, have sort of extended capabilities, and the real kind of end point that most transhumanists are aiming towards is overcoming death itself, becoming technologically immortal. And that involves things like uploading our brains to machines, kind of merging with artificial superintelligence and all these kinds of like far-flung ideas, which seem really kind of sci-fi-ish and are very sci-fi-ish, but are also kind of, they have a real constituency. Unsurprisingly, most of the people who I spent time with when I was writing the book, it seems quite a long time ago now, it is actually quite a long time ago now, but those people were mostly kind of focused around Silicon Valley and Northern California. But it is a global movement that has its kind of adherents all over the world.
Can you just take us back then to where it actually, the whole point of this started for you then, why you got interested in exploring transhumanism?
Yeah, I guess there's a few ways that I could answer this question, all of which would be true in different ways. But I was sort of fascinated by this whole thing for years before it ever occurred to me that I would or could write a book about it. I was kind of I've always been kind of fascinated by people who kind of take quite sort of practical, rolling up their sleeves kind of approaches to big existential problems. And there's a real kind of Promethean sort of urgency to this movement that really attracted me. So I'd kind of been aware of it for a long time and kind of fascinated by it for a long time. But the kind of, I suppose, the genesis really of the book came out of a moment in my own life where really the birth of my first son, and I write about this in the early part of the book, where and it makes it into the show as well, where just the experience of witnessing my wife give birth to our son, who's now 8. Part of the kind of experience of that, as amazing and life-altering as it was, one of the effects of it was I definitely did become kind of preoccupied with the kind of fragility of, first of all, this tiny baby who, I was holding in my hands for the first time, and becoming kind of preoccupied with how vulnerable he was to all these different kinds of, diseases and threats and so on, and how small and fragile his body was, but also just in a general sense, mortality itself starts to kind of come in on you, or at least it did in a more urgent way with me in the immediate aftermath of that experience. So I started to think again about this sort of obsession that I'd had for quite a few years with transhumanism. And I knew that I wanted to write about mortality. I wanted to write about death. But I knew that it would have been difficult for me to write a book, the kind of book that I wanted to write, just about the abstract concept of death, as a person who was then in his early to mid 30s. And yeah, there was something about this idea of people kind of, as I say, rolling up their sleeves and tackling the problem of death as though it were kind of a technological problem with a technological solution, that became really, really interesting to me. And there was so many reasons to write about this. One of which was it gave me an entry point into that kind of big existential problem, but also there's so many kind of absurd and compelling and richly colorful characters involved in this movement. And I was able to kind of go out and sort of tackle these ideas through these people and these scenes and these kind of crazy Promethean sort of projects that they had going, whether it be, mind uploading or cryonics or, various other kinds of sort of lunatic
it makes sense that you would start up. You were dealing with obviously the beginning, and they were looking. It brings you to think about then the ending of what that is. And is it? I mean, it seems to me that it's perhaps fear that's that's driving all of this. It's fear of death, fear of decay, fear of ending. That these people can deal with anything, with any outlandish, crazy idea, as long as they don't have to deal with the prospect of ending, as if that's the worst thing that can happen.
Right. And, in a way, it is kind of one of the worst things that you can imagine happening. At the time, I was on this really kind of, to me, very interesting sort of inflection point between being, I suppose, horrified and fascinated by what these people were doing, but also having a certain kernel of identification, I, at that point, was, struggling with the sort of, my own mortality and mortality in general of everyone around me and everyone I know. It's a big, bitter pill to swallow for all of us, famously.
Well, I suppose, obviously, then, because you just become a father as well, so you have to be alive for your children, your child.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's central to, that's your job, is to stay alive. So you bought a big tank of nitrogen, and I remember when the book was published. I think it was in 2017, and that you said at the time that the strangest place you'd ever been was Alcor Life Extension Foundation, which is in Silicon Valley. I don't know if it's still, because since your subsequent book was about the apocalypse, I'm not sure if it's still the strangest place you've ever been. But you might just explain a bit about what it was like when you arrived there and you met Max Moore, the boss, and what you saw.
Yeah, so Alcor was and is a place in Arizona, just outside of Phoenix in Arizona. And it's the world's largest cryonics facility. So it's a place where cryonics is basically I used to get in trouble for saying pseudoscience. I mean, possibly it is, to me, it seems like a pseudoscience. The science, well, let's put it in inverted commas, of freezing very recently deceased human bodies, preserving them in liquid nitrogen, and keeping them kind of on ice, as it were, for whatever period of time, decades, centuries, whatever it might be, until the technology exists to reconstitute those human bodies and bring them back to life. It's
you say bodies, if I remember rightly, it's not necessarily, if you don't have all the money, you can just freeze the head.
Yeah, most of the people in this facility, they're called patients rather than.
Yeah, sorry, they're still clients.
Yeah, they refer to them as patients, and so they're kept in these gigantic sort of stainless steel vats. They're filled with liquid nitrogen, and a certain number of bodies in sleeping bags suspended in these vats, but mainly decapitated, because people tend to only want to preserve their heads, partly because it's cheaper, but also I think probably more so because transhumanists tend to want to, when they do become technologically revived, you know,
get better bodies.
Or 100, or or upload their brains to machines.
Okay, so there's when I want to talk about uploading, but I'm interested though, when you arrived and you were being taken around by Max Moore around the facility, is there any way of knowing what's actually inside the vats? Are you just told these vats are filled with floating heads and sleeping bags?
Do you mean, did I ask to see inside the vats? I didn't. And a proper journalist would have done exactly that. So for all I know, there was nothing in the vats. It could have been, the whole thing could have been.
And for all the families who are paying however much to keep their...
No, and I could have exposed it as a massive con. You know, I'm just a very trusting, credulous person. You know, I believe those vats are filled with heads and bodies. You know, people, usually what happens is people sign over their life insurance policies
to pay for
alcohol, because it is, you know, it's quite expensive to preserve a body in liquid nitrogen in the Arizona desert in perpetuity. You know, it costs money. So people tend to pay for it with their life insurance policies. So they sign over their life insurance policies to Alcor, often at the kind of, I suppose, like at the expense of their families. And so there are often quite sort of bitter feuds over this, you know, people signing over their estates and their policies to this kind of slightly quackish operation in the desert.
And how did you find Max Moore when you met him?
Well, I knew quite a lot about Max anyway, because he, as well as being the guy who runs this cryonics facility, is one of the kind of leading philosophical lights of transhumanism. He has written probably some of the most influential kind of texts around transhumanism. So he originally sort of made his name as a philosopher and sort of defined a lot of the kind of tenets of this transhumanist movement. And I think just wound up running this facility because he was sort of the best man for the job and like a true believer. And so that's kind of just one part of what he's doing. So I was kind of fascinated by the idea of this man, this figure who was like, you know, in a way quite a serious philosopher with some quite, you know, challenging and controversial and some might say ridiculous ideas, but, you know, a genuine thinker who, you know, found himself running this sort of kind of weird sci-fi mausoleum in the desert. But he's a very interesting man. He's very, he's a remarkable looking character. He's very kind of buff, like a huge kind of hypertrophied kind of guy. And very serious, very like serious minded, kind of straight down the line character. But, you know, it's like so many of these people, they're very intelligent, very rationalistic people. But what they're telling you is, and this is really what gets to the heart of why I think I'm so interested in this movement and why I'm so interested in so many of the things that I write about, is this kind of strange kind of vanishing point where extreme rationalism becomes something other than reason. It becomes something kind of crazy. Yeah, there's a weird kind of line between an extreme kind of investment in science and reason, and that goes over the line into something kind of.
But I remember when we talked about it before, I remember you were saying that you said that a lot of the language used in transhumanism overlaps with the language used in religion. That there are obviously lots of points that they come together on in the Venn diagrams of the transhumanists and the religions. But what the religions have, which is not necessarily true for transhumanists, is that they have hope as a concept. That the transhumanists hope they'll be reborn, but the religions have hope in their current guise that they can do something, whereas transhumanists are really almost waiting now to get to the next stage.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong case to be made that transhumanism is a kind of religion, or at least that it occupies a void that has been left in, you know, an awful lot of people's lives by the kind of receding of religion. And some of the ways in which people talk about technology within the transhumanist movement is, I think, pretty much explicitly religious. When you hear people, not even necessarily, you know, self-proclaimed transhumanists, but the way that a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, talk about AI and like coming advent of AI, superhuman intelligence, and so on, it does start to sound quite religious. And there's this idea of the singularity, which is quite a central kind of idea within the transhumanist movement. And the singularity is basically this idea that at a certain point in the kind of medium-term future, AI will become so powerful and so sophisticated that it's going to change not just our relationship with technology, but also what it means to be human. It'll change the kind of the definition of humanity itself, and we'll become kind of subsumed into this godlike, you know, hyper intelligence, and all our problems will be solved. We'll be able to live forever. We'll be able to kind of solve any kind of mathematical or technical or even political problems. Everything will kind of become it's
boring.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if we're not solving anything, then there's no challenge. So it all becomes
none of your transhumanists, they seem to find it to be the most, it's sort of like the rapture, basically. I mean, I wouldn't be the first person to make that comparison, and I do make it explicitly in the book that it is kind of like the Christian idea of the rapture, of, you know, this apocalyptic sort of.
I know that the scientist, is it Aubrey de Grey, has said that the first person to live to 1,000 years old is already alive today.
Yeah.
Do you think, is that a well-supported theory, or?
Well, I always have to sort of caveat all these responses with saying that I'm not a scientist. So my kind of, I can't look at the evidence that's being presented to me in the way that a scientist would, and say, well, no, this is nonsense because of A, B, and C. Obviously, there's a certain amount of, you might say, common sense that's involved in these things, but the scientific consensus broadly and overwhelmingly with someone like Aubrey de Grey, who is, I won't get into too much detail about what it is he's proposing, but yeah, he's in the sort of realm of radical life extension, whereby the idea is that through sort of monkeying around with the DNA and cells, that you can kind of regenerate human bodies at the cellular level so that they just simply don't age, and that you reverse the aging process sort of incrementally every 5 years or whatever. And people just don't get old, and therefore they don't die. They might die, they might get hit by a bus, but they won't die of cellular aging. That idea is, I think, broadly received with, I would say, politely, quite stern skepticism by the sort of by the gerontology community in general and the medical community in general. But yeah, he's been quite successful in terms of getting funding for his his ideas and for his research. Lots of Silicon Valley people have plowed significant amounts of money into this, and it isn't. I mean, he's not the only person in this area. Obviously, there are probably more scientifically reputable people working in this field. Google, around the time I started writing this book, Google set up a sort of an anti-aging lab that was aimed at ultimately solving the problem of death, which is a very kind of Google kind of moonshot idea. So there, I mean, it is a thing in Silicon Valley. It's like,
there's all. I remember that isn't Elon Musk is another. I mean, Elon Musk is Elon Musk, but isn't Elon? There are people famously. The interesting thing about the cryogenics is that most of the people who have been have given their bodies, or well, most of the patients, sorry, to use the correct term, in there, they're private individuals. They don't reveal who they are. I looked it up the other day, and there's 17 people who are actually officially listed as being in the who've given their, who are patients of the cryogenic movement. But I mean, famously, people like Walt Disney is meant to be frozen, Michael Jackson. I mean, we don't really know how many people actually have done this. I read, there was one story which is incredibly sad, about a woman called Dora Kent, who was one of the 17. And when she was 84, her son worked for Alcor. And when she was 84, she was diagnosed with a terminal disease. She had pneumonia, but it was terminal. And they decided in Alcor that the best thing for her, the best result would be if she went in and died in Alcor, so they could get her at the moment of death. And she chose, or her son chose, just to do the head option. And when a doctor did an autopsy on the body afterwards, he discovered she wasn't fully dead when they'd done it, but Alcor kept the head, so he couldn't do the full. But it seems that there are various shadows lurking around the stainless steel Alcor building, I think.
Yeah, there are a number of different, like, bizarre personal kind of stories that could be written about any of the severed heads in that place. Yeah. No, and it is like the attitude that people have towards cryonics, specifically in the transhumanist kind of milieu, as far as I could see, was that you don't have to, like, it is kind of an absurd idea, but logically the principle is we don't know whether it won't work. You know, who's to say that in 50 years' time science won't have got to the point where you can actually take a severed, like a frozen human brain, thaw it out, and then somehow like magic the, neurons into some kind of a map on a computer, and thereby kind of, reanimate a person's mind and make it live again. I mean, I'm putting it in a deliberately very crude manner, but so most of the people who I spoke to in the transhumanist movement and asked them about cryonics, most of them kind of said, look, yeah, it's a long shot. It's, it's probably not going to work, but it's the best
shot we have
right now.
Yeah.
So, why not, kind of thing. And a lot of them took this sort of attitude of, oh no, I haven't signed up for it yet, but I've been meaning to. It's just a lot of paperwork, and I'll do it eventually. And I probably, kind of like you would with your taxes or something.
Do they talk at all about the soul?
No, not at all. No. I mean, any of the transhumanists I met, and I think overwhelmingly the sort of type of person who is drawn towards transhumanism would be people who see themselves as very staunchly rationalistic, like highly kind of, like largely just atheists, like hardline rationalists. And so any kind of talk of the soul or any way in which you might try to compare transhumanism with religion is usually met with, yes, quite sort of staunch opposition, really. They don't see themselves in that way at all. And they would see talk of like souls and so on as being kind of, just too airy-fairy to really even take seriously, which is kind of ironic in a way, because that's what they're pushing towards,
They were desperately hoping to find, in the second strand that you deal with in the book is this brain uploading element, which I find fascinating, because in terms of brain uploading, the body, in fact, the whole human structure, the head included, but apart from the brain, everything we are is just meat. I think the term you used I liked was meat casing. We're all like sausages. We're all just a casing on our brain. We could be anything, but we just have our own individual meat casing. And what they're hoping is that we'll all eventually be amalgamated into this mother machine that you spoke of. What did you discover when, in terms of like, were they all on the same page as to their vision of the mother machine, or is it all different groups? Are they all unified in how they see this is all going to work? Is there a same page element to it?
No, not really. I mean, there are as many versions of singularity, to use that term again, as there are almost people who write about it and think about it. Of course, there are thinkers who are more influential than others. Ray Kurzweil is kind of the big figure in all of this. He wrote this book called The Singularity is Near, which he predicts the date. He puts a date on the singularity, which I think is 2045. He may have kind of revised it further back since then. I'm not quite sure. But the sort of, so people imagine that, brain uploading might amount to, you upload your brain into a humanoid robot. a kind of Black Mirror type scenario where you're uploaded into an android that looks like to all intents and purposes, like a human being. Or it could be, I spoke to one guy writing the book who imagined himself being uploaded into like a Mars rover kind of thing, just exploring the outer reaches of the universe. People talk about disembodied intelligence, where you're just kind of floating in the cloud. You're just kind of like pure mind stuff. So there are loads of different kind of versions of what it might be like. I think most people would have some kind of vision of post-human immortal existence that would be you would be embodied in some way. You would be some kind of a humanoid type creature. And this, I spoke to one transhumanist, Max Moore's wife, actually, whose whole thing was like, she's an artist and she designs these kind of post-human bodies with sort of superhuman capabilities into which your mind would be uploaded after you come back.
Is it, because it seems like unbelievable narcissism. Did you find these people to be, some of the stories actually in the book, and I want to talk about one particular one when you went on the presidential campaign train, but did you find that they were people that you could connect with, or were they just giant egos who were having this idea of that they personally deserve to be immortalized? It's not that everyone deserves to be immortalized, but it's a personal.
Yeah, it is. Transhumanism is, for me, a product of like a very extreme individualistic ideology. I think it's no coincidence that it has its kind of largest constituency in California, which is sort of the home of American individualism in a lot of ways. And I think there's a kind of a Californian ideology of like, maximum health and sort of maximum longevity that it kind of meshes with, in a way, it meshes with the sort of Silicon Valley techno-utopian side of California, which I think is a really interesting aspect of it. But to sort of answer your question, I don't think I would have tried to write the book if it wasn't my intention to try to find some points of identification with these people. Like, it would have been so easy. And obviously, the book is funny, I hope, and people tend to find it funny. And a lot of the humor arises out of the kind of absurdity of these ideas, and, in a lot of cases, the absurdity of the people and the way that they talk about these ideas. But I think, like, it was always important to me to write it in such a way that I could always find some way of humanizing these people. And I think there is like, there was a lot of it that I found completely absurd and often objectionable, but often very touching and kind of weirdly sort of relatable at the same time as well,
Well, as I mentioned, one of my favorite stories in the book was when you spent a week on it was a coffin-shaped, the bus of this US presidential hopeful called Zoltan Istvan. And I remember he had a guy who worked with him called Rowan, who was absolutely wonderful. But how did you find yourself, firstly, on the coffin bus, and what experiences did you have?
Yeah, Zoltan I met, he was one of the first people I met on the first trip I did to the Bay Area when I started doing the reporting for the book first. And at that point, he was just this guy. He was like this really exuberant guy who showed up at a conference I was at on transhumanism and religion, actually. And he had no sort of official kind of business at the conference. He was not really, and he hadn't really established himself in the transhumanist scene in the Bay Area at that point. He was at that stage, he had just kind of retired. He'd sold a lot of property. He was kind of a real estate guy, and he made a lot of money in property in the Bay Area in the kind of early, like mid 2000s. And was looking for kind of something to do with his time and his money. And I got talking to him, and we kind of kept in touch a bit. And I guess maybe about 9 months after I met him first, I had a Zoom call with him, or a Skype call as they used to be back in those days. And he mentioned that he was planning to run for president. And I kind of thought, well, that's an obvious kind of sort of angle for the book. And he mentioned that he'd bought this school bus, like an old school bus, and he'd got a carpenter acquaintance of his to rig it up to look like a coffin, and the plan was to drive across the continental United States with this gigantic school bus, raising awareness about his campaign for president, but also raising awareness about the need to invest in radical life extension research because of
the coffin the best emblem for that?
Well, he's trying to remind people that death is real and death is coming for us, and death has to be struggled against, and that we can evade death if we, put all our kind of Zoltan's idea, which is kind of crazy, but maybe not that crazy, was that like the American government spends obviously a completely insane amount of public funds on foreign wars, and maybe it would make more sense to use that money to invest in like radical life extension research. So that was his obviously insane idea for a political platform. And I think, to be fair to him, like, he's a smart enough guy. He's got a bunch of degrees. He's got a degree in philosophy from Harvard, and like he's a bit of an intellectual. He knew that he wasn't, he's not a complete lunatic. He knew that he wasn't going to trouble the serious candidates in the election. He's kind of a self-promoter in the classic American kind of style. So yeah, it was like just a real opportunity to write a kind of a Ken Kesey style sort of narrative of this sort of slightly wild political campaign that was in a way like totally comical and absurd on the surface, and also quite deep down as well, but also there's some serious kind of ideas at play. So yeah, like I spent about a week, maybe a week and a half on this coffin bus with Zoltan, driving across the state of Texas. It was me and Zoltan and this guy, Rowan, who was his kind of campaign aide stroke documentarian stroke like fanboy, who was shooting a documentary on the bus as well, and kind of getting up in people's face. He was like he was almost like a kind of like an evangelical Christian, but for science, and in fact he came from a Christian background, so he had that kind of like inbuilt sort of zeal, and I just found him like a really comical in a way, but also like really touching and kind of just very strangely kind of profound character. I just was very fascinated by him, and I got to...
It was obvious that Rowan has a lot of sweetness, even though he is, I can't remember exactly, but I think he was barely eating and barely drinking and was not having sex, and he was living a very chaste life, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, he's like an ascetic, like almost like a monk or something, really. Yeah, because he read a lot of research about the kinds of lifestyles that were most likely to, give you longevity. And he was interested in longevity per se, but also he wanted to stay alive long enough to catch the wave of science that would actually allow him to live forever, if you know what I mean.
And how did the Texans react to having these two men in a coffin bus come around and tell them their lives?
Imagine that, like, driving through the Bible Belt with this kind of like agenda would give rise to some pretty hairy moments. But no, I mean, like, Americans are like largely very open-minded, and kind of like, there was a lot of like, we stopped in a lot of truck stops and met a lot of like truckers who I think were just kind of like interested to talk to anyone who wasn't a trucker. And I mean, we met like bunches of kind of transhumanists along the way. There were stop-offs where we would meet with other people who were kind of broadly in the movement, but largely it was just people, fueling their cars and like stopping off and so on. It was a truly bizarre thing to have spent a week and a half doing. Actually, it seems even more bizarre now. It seems unreal to me.
Do you know at all what's happened? I mean, obviously, I don't know, obviously, but I know that bits of the book were excerpted into the New York Times, so it's likely that Zoran and Rowan, that they had a chance to at least read that. Do you know what they made of your depictions of them?
I didn't hear from everyone who I wrote about in the book. Zoltan was absolutely thrilled to be featured in the Times magazine. That was a big boost to him and for
his next presidential campaign. He'll have that.
He did run again, actually. I think he ran for governor of California. I've kind of lost touch with him a bit. We did stay in touch for a while because I really liked him. Yeah, he ran, I think, again, needless to say, unsuccessfully for California governor, whenever the last one was, a couple of years back. But yeah, no, he was actually very pleased with the piece, and I think he knew that like there were aspects of how I portrayed him that were comical, but again, how could you avoid that with someone like Sultan? But yeah, I think he was pretty happy about the whole thing, which is always a bonus. It's not necessarily what you set out to do, but it is gratifying.
Do you know how? I want to talk about how the book has then been transformed into a play, which obviously is coming to Paris next week. Do you know how the transhumanists, how they've dealt with the pandemic? Have you heard from? Has it been something that's a very big topic on their discussion boards, or because obviously we're all disembodied heads, as I mentioned at the beginning. So I mean, this is obviously their future. This is the world they're progressing towards. What we're doing now.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I haven't really, my contact with the transhumanist world has been pretty minimal over the last few years. But it did strike me that when the pandemic happened, my second book had just come out, which is about apocalyptic kind of movements and apocalyptic preparedness and so on, which, a lot of people made the point, and I would not argue with them, that the book kind of benefited from an unexpected kind of spike in relevance at the time it came out. But in a weird sort of way, it seemed like, and at the time we started like working on the play, it seemed like actually transhumanism was the much more relevant context for this, because there was a sense in which we, as you said at the beginning, like everything, it's still the case to some degree now, but certainly back in early 2020, spring 2020, everything was just disembodied, all relationships were kind of mediated through technology. So many conversations were had in this manner through Zoom. It seemed as though we completely lost contact with the physical world, with the outside world. And, technology was kind of colonizing more and more of our lives and our society and so on. So
and we adapted to that. We accepted that to a degree,
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And that was kind of the context out of which we started to write the play as well, that kind of weird, anxious moment with technology, and obviously an increased awareness of the fragility of the human body. And
so it's not a book that necessarily you read and you go, oh my gosh, this would be a wonderful stage play. How did it's huge philosophical ideas, it's all science, it's these crazy characters. So I'm wondering how did the idea of even putting it on stage, or some version of it on stage, come about?
Yeah, you're right. It was definitely not an obvious candidate for adaptation. Certainly not theatrical adaptation. And there was never any chance that we would try to sort of do justice to the book, or try to reproduce the book in any kind of theatrical form. That would be a recipe for disaster, I think it's fair to say. But yeah, I mean, like, we have been talking about it for quite a long time, actually. Bush and I and Ben have been friends for years. Bush and Ben, who are the creative directors of Dead Center. So we've known each other for a really long time, and we had talked for years about doing something together. And then what happened was, so the book won this prize called the Welcome Prize. And Bush kind of saw an opportunity to kind of get a production over the line, get funding at that particular moment. And he decided that we should do an adaptation of To Be a Machine. He'd read the book and he liked it. And I was kind of skeptical at first as to how we would do it. But I'm a huge fan of their theater, of their work, and I know that they tend to take on projects that seem at first quite unwieldy and maybe sort of slightly eccentric in terms of adaptation.
And they also use a lot of technology in their shows. I mean, prior to this one, they've used a huge amount of technology. Even in Hamnet, they did a version of Hamnet which was all kind of holograms of characters, and it was very futuristic.
That's right. And that's one of the things I love about their work, is that there's always some kind of gimmick, in a way, that they make absolutely justify itself and become kind of part of the central kind of conceit of the work. And this play ended up being no different, but it took a while to get there. You know, initially we were going to do, you know, a sort of a relatively straightforward stage play with an audience. Jack became attached fairly early on, so we knew that
the actor in this play, it's a one-man show, is Jack Gleeson.
Yeah.
People will know best probably from Game of Thrones.
Yeah, for sure.
I've actually never seen, but
yeah,
he was a neighbour in Dublin. That's how I know Jack.
Yeah.
And it was Tiny Tim in the Gate Theatre's production a very long time ago when he was a little boy.
That was Tiny Tim in Christmas Carol.
I'm sure Jack was Tiny Tim, a really wonderful Tiny Tim. So good that I remembered his name when he became an adult actor. Yeah.
No, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah, so we, like Bush and Ben and Jack and I, sat around for a week in the very beginning of 2020, in like February of 2020, maybe January actually, and sort of bounced around a lot of ideas as to how we would do this, what aspects of the book would work, what could be expanded on, what could be kind of sidelined completely. And it was a very interesting and sort of fruitful week, but it was going in the direction of, we're going to put a show on a stage with an audience. And then the pandemic happened and it just kind of got completely, you know, shelved, or at least that was what we kind of assumed. And then the Dublin Theatre Festival looked like it wasn't going to happen in any form. But then at a certain point in early summer 2020, they got in touch and said, look, we have a certain amount of funding to put on kind of COVID safe productions, you know, for people to find ways of putting on shows that would sort of circumvent putting bodies packed together in a room. So yeah, I mean, Bush and Ben particularly were really gung-ho to do this because there was no other theatre really happening at that point. So it was a way of working. It was a way of kind of putting people together and getting people doing stuff. And we just kind of sat around and we had a few ideas. One of which was that we knew that the kind of mind uploading and cryonics aspect of things might work for some kind of show, and that we wanted it to be some kind of monologue where Jack would be playing a version of me talking about the ideas at the center of the book. And the idea then that really kind of kicked it up a gear was the idea to have the audience as uploaded heads in the theatre space itself, to have a bunch of iPads that would feature the heads of the audience. And that was, if I remember right, that was Ben's idea initially, and it seemed completely outlandish to me. I remember my reaction initially was like, I mean, sure, it's never going to work, but yeah, let's talk about it. Why not?
Are they live streaming? So can you see the audience's reaction? Or is it...
No, what happens is when you book a ticket, there's a process that you go through where you record yourself in various kinds of facial sort of arrangements. So with your eyes closed, laughing, you know, looking serious and so on. And they're played on a loop throughout the play and played in sort of various kind of permutations throughout. So, and I think that's the thing that really makes the play really special, in that you as an audience member are watching it on your laptop, but you know, you see the audience on the screen and you see Jack interacting with the audience live. And for me, every time I've watched it, I've always found the moments where the camera scans through the audience just strangely kind of moving and powerful. It'll be interesting to see it next week, because this is, you know, the last time we did a version of it was sort of middle of last year, I think. And things have changed in terms of the pandemic since then. So it'll be interesting to see how it works in the changed.
Has Jack given his feedback on how it is to perform to this audience of iPads? Does he find, because obviously actors really respond, they feed off an audience. Can he feed off these transhumanist heads?
Well, I suppose the short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that you'd have to ask Jack. But like, you know, he's a television actor, and in some ways it's like live television in a lot of ways, you know. It's he's acting to a camera as opposed to the audience, but he's acting live. So yeah, it's a strange thing because you know the audience is out there. You can see, you know, like a Zoom thing or whatever, you can see them coming up, and you know who's in that night. You know, like you know, like any sort of play, you know a few people who are in that night, and you see their faces, and it is weirdly like having an audience, but in this strange sort of eerie, uncanny, disembodied way where they just sort of appear on these screens.
And Jack is actually coming to Paris though to do it. It's done live in the venue.
That's right.
Have you had any transhumanists come to the show?
That's a good question. Not that I know of, actually, no. And I don't know if anyone who I wrote about in the book has come to see the play, as it were.
Because you can watch it from anywhere, no?
You can watch it from anywhere, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so I could be Zoltan on my coffin bus.
You could be, yeah.
Watching the play. No, I'm just wondering, as I'd be curious to know how they would feel, or I don't know if there's how international the transhumanist movement is, if we have much of a transhumanist movement here in France.
My understanding is that they're in pretty much every country. I mean, one of the kind of weird things that happened when I started writing the book, and definitely when the book came out, and when I would do events in, you know, various countries or whatever, there would always be people who would come along because you know, they were interested in transhumanism or whatever. But there were like a number of people read the book or heard me talk about it, and this was never the intention of the book, got interested in transhumanism through reading it or hearing me talk about it, and became kind of transhumanists. I got an email from a woman not that long after the book came out, who was a lawyer in London, like a corporate lawyer, and she said she'd read the book, and she'd got like a chip implanted in her arm. She didn't say exactly what the chip did, pretty basic stuff, I imagine. But she'd never heard of transhumanism before she read the book, but she was so enthused by it, she decided she was going to become the UK's first cyborg barrister, and she was very proud of this fact, and she just wanted to email me to tell me that this was the response to the book.
And
so
her husband is now suing your publishers, no?
Yeah, I haven't heard if that's the case, then yeah.
So Mark, I don't know if anyone has any questions, but before I leave, I wanted to ask, obviously you've been slightly terrifyingly prescient. You do this book about transhumanism, and then you do another book about the apocalypse. I don't even know if I want to know what you're writing about now, but is it something less anxious?
Yes, no, it's not actually. No. It's a true crime book, basically. It's a book about a famous murder case that happened in Ireland in the early 80s. Okay. So it's a book about that, basically.
But you've left these apocalyptic end of work. You've come to terms with mortality now. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, I mean, no, I'll never come to terms with mortality, but I've shelved it in terms of my work.
Come to terms with not coming to terms with it.
Yeah. And this new book is quite different in the sense that it's both of my previous books have been not quite essay collections, but they're sort of collections of distinct pieces around a quite sort of tightly defined theme, I suppose. Whereas this new book is a single narrative. It tells a single story over the course of the book. So it's kind of a bit of a departure for me in that sense.
And is it done? Is it coming out?
No, there's a very, very bad draft that I'm finishing at the moment, and then hopefully there will be better drafts in time.
So about that, unless anyone has any questions, I'd say a very big thank you to. I'd love to give out details of the play. I know it's on in the CENTQUATRE in Paris next week. I don't know if
it is actually this week, would you believe?
Sorry, we're already in this week. Yes.
It runs from Wednesday the 15th to the 19th, which I think is Sunday. Yes, so from Wednesday to Sunday in the CENTQUATRE in Paris. Whether there are tickets left is another question. Thank you both so much for a most enjoyable conversation. Sophie, I'll be seeing you soon. You're Paris based, and Mark, we had spoken about the possibility of you traveling to Paris next year. I hope you'll be able to join us sometime, yes, in the autumn of 2022.
Yeah, I would absolutely love that.
Great, thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.